Hello, today we're going to talk about the basics of domestic violence and sexual assault, what it is, and a little bit about what we can do as a community to help people who have experienced domestic violence and sexual assault. This is just some content warning. Obviously, we go over the facts and information about domestic violence and sexual abuse, as well as rape and trauma. So you know best what situation you're emotionally safe in. So please take care of yourself and take breaks as needed as you watch this training. Here at Canyon Creek Services, we believe in having communities free of domestic violence and sexual assault. This is a big goal, but it's an important goal. We don't accept that domestic violence and sexual assault are normal parts of life because we know they can be prevented. And so our goal is zero domestic violence and sexual assault because any other goal is not acceptable. We are a nonprofit agency serving Iron Beaver and Garfield counties here in Utah, and we're the only domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy organization, advocacy for survivors in these three counties. We offer free and confidential services for all survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And when we say all survivors, we do mean all survivors. We also provide community education, not just about awareness about domestic violence and sexual assault, but also education on how we as a community can work together towards that larger social change of communities free of domestic violence and sexual assault, because we can't do it alone. We're not big enough. We need everyone's help. So what exactly do we do at Canyon Creek Services? We do both intervention and prevention. So intervention is those survivor services, serving survivors after they've experienced domestic violence and sexual assault. And then prevention is preventing that violence from ever happening in the first place, again, through that community education and working with community leaders on changing policies and laws so that we can help eradicate this public health issue in our community. We have our Survivor Services Office. They do the intervention, which is things like victim advocacy, court and medical accompaniment, crisis intervention, safety planning, housing services, individual service plans, information and referral, child and youth services, emergency shelter services. So that's serving survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. We also have our volunteer program, and our volunteer program is incredibly important because we do rely on volunteers to really help us achieve our goals and fulfill our work here. We have our development department, and they are essentially fundraising, so they help get donations from the community, which we also really rely on. And then our awareness and prevention department, they help with services awareness, which is letting people know what we do, posting posters around town and bathrooms, just so that survivors know who we are and how to access our services if they want to. Because if they don't know who we are and they don't know what they do, what we do, they're never gonna call us, right? And then the prevention part, again, is that community education and that community working with that community to help prevent violence from ever happening. And then our business and operations department, they do the day-to-day operations that any business has, like payroll and HR paperwork. The scope of our work, this is from last fiscal year. Our fiscal year runs from July 1 to July 1. We serve 770 clients. And while we're best known for our emergency shelter, if you'll notice, we only served 165 shelter clients last fiscal year out of our 770 clients, which our shelter is a really important service, but this is just to note that we have so many more services that we provide for survivors, and that our survivors not only have diverse experiences, but diverse needs. So now that you know what Canyon Creek does, let's talk about abuse. It's kind of uncomfortable to talk about and to think about, but it's so important because if we can't talk about it, we're never going to be able to prevent it from happening. These are just some statistics. So the first two bullet points are kind of lumped together. So nationally, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, which does not include emotional or psychological violence. This is just physical, sexual, and stalking. So keep that in mind. That number is most likely much higher because we know that verbal, emotional, psychological violence can be just as damaging as, if not more than that physical violence. And then that, again, this is just physical violence. In Utah, this number is actually higher. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Every 73 seconds, so that's almost every minute, someone is sexually assaulted in the US. More than 40% of adult homicides are domestic violence related. The presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%. Now, this doesn't mean the gun was used to commit the homicide. This just means that there was a gun in the home where the domestic violence was occurring. This is from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, also known as the UDVC, just showing that 1 in 3 women in Utah will experience intimate partner violence, and also 1 in 3 women will be sexually assaulted. That's a lot. It's really sad how many people are affected by this. So what exactly is domestic violence? It's a pattern of abusive behavior that is practiced in order to gain or maintain power and control over others. Often includes domination, isolation, and fear. So again, it's a pattern, and really the power and control is a crucial element to domestic violence. And domestic violence is not just between intimate partners, it can be between siblings, it can be between children and their parents, or parents and their children. Any sort of that familial relation is housed under domestic violence. This is the power and control wheel, and this just shows all of the ways that domestic violence happens, all of the ways that an abuser, or we call them perpetrators sometimes, gain that power and control over the survivor. Emotional abuse, economic abuse, we'll go through all the different kinds of abuse in a minute, but this just really goes to show it's not just physical. We sometimes think of violence as just physical, but it can include so much more. If there's an element and power and control and someone trying to exert it over someone else, that's violence. But on the other hand, we have the equality wheel, which is much more positive. This is what a healthy relationship looks like, right? It's the opposite of a domestic violence relationship. It involves, equality and trust and respect, where there's no power and control. Instead of one person having more power than the other, they both have equal amounts. This is the cycle of violence. So this is really kind of important to understand. Just know that this is a pattern that happens in a lot of domestic violence relationships, and it doesn't necessarily always have to happen this way, but it is a good, general pattern to be aware of. So we'll start at the bottom where there's violence occurring. Again, this doesn't have to be physical. We often think of violence as physical. It can be sexual, digital, verbal, emotional, any kind of power and control. So there's a violent incident where the abuser does something violent to the victim. And this is when you can see the abuser's actions and the victim's response in each part of the cycle. This is when the victim calls the police, tries to leave, etc. And then we have the honeymoon phase. So this is when the abuser apologizes and says, I'm never going to do this again, I'm so sorry. And the victim decides to stay or feels happy and hopeful. And on average, it takes 7 times for a victim to leave their abuser because there's so much, it's sometimes not safe, just the psychology of it. So that's an average. Some people leave after 1 cycle, but some people leave after 50, right? But 7 on average. And then the tension phase. This is for all intents and purposes when the victim feels like they're walking on eggshells. So it's a build up to the violence. They know they're trying to make the abuser, trying to make the violence not happen, right? And the abuser just, it's like being around someone where you don't know what to say, what you're going to do that's going to upset them. And then the more times this cycle repeats, usually the violence increases in severity and how frequent it happens. So they complete the cycle quicker. So let's talk about the abuser or the perpetrator. Why do they abuse? What are they doing? why do they think it's okay to treat someone else like that? A belief and desire they should have power and control over their partner. So even in sexual assault and rapes, it's about power and control, and sex is just the excuse they use. Sense of entitlement. There are social norms that allow and condone or encourage abuse and violence, like harmful gender stereotypes, like the man is in charge and the woman has to be submissive. And then just cultural attitude. So anything that an abuser looks like at general society and is like, oh, society says this is okay, so it is. Belief that they can get away with it, which unfortunately is often true. They think they know best. They've learned that being abusive gets them what they want, and they believe that their life takes priority. And then on the other hand, who can be a victim? Anyone. These are people with power, with celebrity and fame. Men, women, children, anyone can be a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault. And it doesn't discriminate. And, think about people who don't have, power or influence in society. If people with power and influence can experience abuse, certainly those that don't have any can as well. Let's talk about male survivors. This is incredibly important because often society says that, oh, men don't experience abuse, and that's absolutely not true. We know it's not. 1 in 9 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 19 men have been stalked by an intimate partner during their lifetime. 1 in at least 6 men have been sexually abused or assaulted. And 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So there are a lot of barriers specifically for male survivors when they try to access services or when they try to tell people, hey, I've been abused. Hey, I've been assaulted. I've been raped. People say that doesn't happen, or you're bigger than them, but that's really harmful to say, and that's not fair because men experience abuse as well, and we're here to serve male survivors. So these are the different types of abuse. We have physical abuse. This is what people probably most commonly think about. On the right-hand column, you'll see some interesting ones like weight control. So that is a type of physical abuse. Telling someone that what they can and can't eat, or making them step on the scale every morning. It's not necessarily that they want them to lose weight, but maybe the scale can't move, right? Like you have to be the same weight every day. And that is a form of abuse, right? Because they're trying to have that control over their weight. And then sleep deprivation is also interesting. I know that when I'm sleep deprived, I am much easier to control. I'm much easier, my mind's not really working as well because it's fuzzy because I'm tired, right? Emotional and verbal abuse. You can also read this list as well, but it's just that abuse that's not physical, but it's threatening, it's lying to people about you, it's trying to isolate you from your friends and family, destroying your property, embarrassing you, telling you what to wear, telling you what to do, preventing you from working, those kinds of things. And emotional and verbal abuse can be just as harmful, if not more harmful, than physical. That's really important to know, like insulting someone and just trying to have power and control over their emotions and how they feel about themselves. Sexual violence. So this would include like rape, right? Sexual violence is pressuring, coercing, or forcing someone to do anything sexual that they are not comfortable with and or do not consent to. So sometimes when we think sexual assault, we think it has to be about sex, but it can be anything from unwanted kissing or touching. It can even be verbal, right? Sexual harassment, calling, saying something sexual to someone without their consent. Something else that's interesting about this is it's not just like, oh, I did something and they didn't want me to. It's lying about what you're going to do, right? So I really like this graphic on the side about consent fries. It's really easy to remember. Freely given. Consent is freely given, so you're not coerced into doing something. It's reversible. So just because you agree to kiss someone doesn't mean that halfway through you can change your mind, right? You can still change your mind at any point. and be like, nah, never mind, I'm not interested, right? Informed. So this is something like this bullet point, keeping someone from protecting themselves from sexually transmitted infections. So sometimes people will lie and be like, oh, I don't have HIV, or they won't even bring it up. And at that point, that's not informed consent, right? They don't know that you have an STI, and so they never consented to that because they didn't know about it. Enthusiastic. So when people say, I don't know, and then something sexual happens, that's not enthusiastic. And then specific. So just because someone agrees to, kissing doesn't mean they want to have sex, or just because they agreed to one kind of sex doesn't mean they agreed to rough sex, right? And then another one that's always interesting to me that I've just learned about is restricting access to birth control. That is a form of sexual violence, because that's trying to control someone's reproductive system. This is so, so important. Sex without consent is sexual assault. Period, the end. It's not sex, it's sexual assault. We also have financial violence. This is going to sound like a made-up statistic, but it's not. 99% of people who experience domestic violence experience financial abuse. 99%. Because think how easy it is to control someone if you control their money, if all of it. So either like giving them an allowance or monitoring what they buy, or like forbidding them to work. So money is so crucial to like having a place to live, having a car to go to work, buying food, right? Saying like, oh, you can only spend $10 a week on food. Any sort of power and control over that money is financial abuse, and it's incredibly prevalent. And here at Canyon Creek, we see it a lot. That's why we serve survivors. We try to help them financially sometimes as well, or find a house, because it's not just that they need help, filling out a rental application. They don't have money because their abuser controlled it. Digital abuse. This kind of overlaps with emotional and verbal abuse, but it happens online, right? Like sending threatening texts, embarrassing someone on social media, like constantly harassing them online, hacking into your accounts, or being like, you have to give me all of your passwords. There's a lot of really scary things that abusers can use technology for. They can install spyware on your phone or your computer and track who you talk to and what you say and what your internet searches are, and they can put a GPS on your car. So digital abuse is just using technology to have power and control over someone. Now that we've talked about the kinds of abuse, let's talk about trauma and how it impacts us, and human beings and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self, and their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. So, experiencing trauma. This is kind of like a really simplified version of how our brains as humans, everyone, processes trauma this way. So first, the brain perceives a threat. And in this situation, it would be, right, like abuse of some kind, domestic violence, a verbally violent act, a physically violent act, whatever it is, it perceives the threat. It's like, oh, this is a threat to me. And second, the brain interprets it as a life-threatening event. So the brain's not just like, oh, this scary thing's happening. The brain's literally saying, this is threatening my life. And so the brain alerts the body to respond in order to minimize pain. So the brain's not necessarily trying to escape from the situation. It's just trying to minimize pain. And then the brain stores the experience, which is when you have things like post-traumatic stress disorder. And we'll talk about the effects of trauma in a minute. So trauma responses, the brain does all of that very quickly, and it's not a conscious decision. And that's why, everyone reacts to trauma differently. And everyone, experiencing violence is a traumatic experience. So every survivor is going to react to that differently. And again, the brain perceives that violence as life-threatening and prepares the body to die or suffer harm in the least painful way possible. So the body's not trying to escape. The body's literally just trying to die painlessly. This is when we get the trauma response that you'll hear fight, flight, or freeze. So again, it's a subconscious thing that your brain is just telling your body to do. Are you going to run? Are you going to fight? Are you going to freeze? A large number of victims actually report that they experience temporary paralysis during their attack. So like sexual assault or rape. And this is known as tonic immobility. So they even, a lot of them will say, like, I always told myself I would fight, and I was literally paralyzed and couldn't move while it was happening. It wasn't a choice that they made. And then 50% of victims who reported fighting back felt that they made the rape more violent. So fighting isn't always the answer. And so it's unfair to ask someone, well, why didn't you fight back? Because it might not have been safe. And the body's trauma response doesn't always allow for someone to, fight, because that's not the way the brain has decided is a painless way to die. Trauma has a lot of really harmful long-term effects. A person who has experienced trauma will deny the events. Even they'll develop like detachment or numbness towards the trauma, and they'll have emotional outbursts, shame and guilt, so feeling guilty for what happened. So somatic symptoms are basically physical responses like sleep problems, breathing problems, stomach problems, high blood pressure. So really physical problems. This is, the brain storing the memory, right, affects you. And they'll often have unhealthy coping skills like substance abuse and self-harm, suicidal ideation, and development of PTSD. And not everyone's response, again, like the immediate response to trauma, the long-term effect of trauma can look different for different people. So now that we've been thoroughly depressed, what can you do? You can be an active bystander. So an active bystander is a disruptor of a pattern or situation that may lead to harm or violence and challenges social norms. So those social norms we talked about, that an abuser feels like, oh, well, I deserve to, abuse someone else. I deserve to have power and control. Or those social norms like a man gets to be in charge and the woman just has to do what he says. Those are social norms that as an active bystander, you can challenge when you hear someone talk about it. And to be an active bystander, the first step is to stay safe. You need to be really aware of your safety, because it doesn't do you any good to be harmed by trying to be an active bystander and intervene. You need to first take stock of what's a safe way for you to intervene. And then there's 3 steps. You can direct, distract, or delegate. So a direct approach to intervention is, say you're at on the sidewalk and you hear your friend catcall someone. You can directly say, hey, I don't think that was okay, or you need to stop that, right? Just directly telling someone, please stop, that's not okay. Distracting, depending on if it's safe, sometimes being direct doesn't work. So a method of distracting is, maybe you see a couple getting into a really bad argument in a store and it seems like maybe it could be harmful, right? You could, go up to them and be like, hey, I'm so sorry, can you reach the top shelf for me? Or you can drop something, right? So they're all distracted by what you dropped. And then delegate. Delegating would be going to someone who can help you, like a manager at a store, or maybe someone who's closer to the situation and knows the people better and can, go and talk to them. Basically, it's just stepping in when you see something harmful or something that could be harmful. And you don't have to do it alone. We're holding each other accountable, and that can be really scary. But try to get people involved. And the more we do this, the more normal it becomes. Think about a society where everyone's stepping in when they see something that's not okay and calling it out. I think people will start to realize oh, what I'm doing is not okay, right? And stop doing it. Other ways you can help, responding appropriately to, a survivor who discloses that they've experienced abuse may save someone's life. They've chosen you as a safe person in a safe space. And so if you educate yourself and know your resources and start by believing that what they tell you is true, right? Don't doubt that their experiences, that opens the gate for them to come to you again to ask for help. Because if you don't respond appropriately, they might never tell anyone ever again what's happened to them. So if a survivor comes to you and shares their story, these are some helpful responses. Again, you start by believing, right? What they tell you. Never doubt their story. Say, I'm concerned for your safety. I'm so sorry that happened to you. No, nobody deserves to be treated like that. They had no right to do that to you. You are not alone. That sounds really scary. This must be really difficult for you, or there's help available. So basically, just letting them know they're not alone and that you care about them. Don't ever judge them. Don't ever tell them what they should do. That's not empowering. That doesn't feel good when people tell you what to do or how you should feel. That's actually really harmful. These are the 3 keys to remember when you respond to a survivor. Listen, validate, and normalize. So listening, basically be an active listener. Like I said, they've identified you as a safe person, so you need to have posture that's open and welcoming. You know, you need to be, your tone of voice needs to communicate that you're listening. Like nod your head, repeat what they say back to you, right? Just use those skills, your physical body language, to show that you care about what they're telling you. And then validate. So you're not making judgments. Again, you're not telling them what they should do or blaming them for the situation, because it's never their fault. Just kind of repeat back what you hear. And again, that's part of the active listening, is this validation. Be like, oh, so it sounds like this happened. And then if the survivor corrects you or you didn't misunderstood, ask for clarification. And then the last step is normalize. So survivors are often isolated as a tactic of abuse. That isolation is incredibly powerful. So they often feel like they're alone, they're the only one going through this, and they're not. We know that's incredibly common. Let them know that their experience is unique, because it definitely is, but that other people experience abuse in our community. The tactics are used by abusers everywhere. And their feelings and their responses, it's a normal way to feel. What they're not crazy, they're not alone. And then again, that not alone is telling them that someone's here to help them. Canyon Creek Services, give them our hotline number. And then this is the most important thing: stay in your lane. Remember what your role is and what it's not. Your job is not to save someone. They make their own choices. They get to just choose what they want to do in a situation. Your job is just to support their choices and let them know you're worried about them or concerned for them. This includes a warned handoff. So if your friend or someone comes up to you and says, hey, I've experienced this abuse, you can't help them, because that's not something you've been trained to do, but maybe an advocate can. You say, oh, thank you for telling me. You validate, normalize. Someone can help. Would you like to call Canyon Creek Services with me? So calling someone with them, right? Or, being like, I'm not sure if I can help you, because it is okay to say, I don't know, or I'll find someone who can help. And then calling that person and say, hey, I have someone here who has experienced this. Can you help them, right? Helping them supporting them through the entire process, because they came to you as their safe person, and to just abandon them is not helpful. And then if you get stuck, call Canyon Creek Services. We are here to help, because it's okay. No one knows everything. Advocates even sometimes have to say, I don't know. And that's okay. We're all human, and we're all just doing our best. So let's review some concepts. Canyon Creek Services has a vision of communities free of domestic violence and sexual assault, and we provide free confidential services to all survivors. Domestic violence and sexual assault are rooted in power and control. Consent violations also play a large role in violence perpetration. Types of abuse can be physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, financial, and digital. Trauma, experience violence impacts people differently, and it has long-term effects. How to prevent it? You can help by intervening when you witness unhealthy or abusive behaviors, and you can challenge ideas that lead to violence. And how to help a survivor is you use your listening skills to validate and normalize what they're telling you. And remember to stay in your lane. Remember what your job is. Your job isn't to save. Whether you be a friend, family member, whether this is your job to help them, you're still not there to save them. you would like, you can follow us on social media to learn more about how you can help survivors, how you can help prevent violence in community, and just see what we at Canyon Creek Services are doing. And if you have any questions, like I said, if you're a survivor or know a survivor, the best way to contact our advocates for help is our 24-hour hotline. This number, 435-233-5732. You can call that or text that number 24/7, or you can email us if you have more general questions about how you can help, or how, if you need more information about domestic violence and sexual assault.